Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me? Excellent, thank you. Welcome to this evening's fundraising event. My name is Susanna Perry. I'm the chair of the local party, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event. We're here because we're interested in China, but we're also here to generate the excitement, the cash, and the activism we need to get our candidates elected. I'd like to introduce our candidates. Here is Edward, our parliamentary candidate, and Alistair, could you stand up please? Alistair Barr, who is our candidate for the Marylebone local elections, one of our candidates for the Marylebone local elections in May. Thank you, Alistair. So if you haven't already done so, please visit edwardlucas.com, where you can sign up as a volunteer, join the Lib Dems, and donate. And on the subject of donations, Sally, could you stand up, please? Sally is here with the card machine. Oh, sorry, Sally is here with the card machine that will be over there if you'd like to make any donations. And also you can see over in the corner there is a table with Sir Vince's books on it, and if you wish to buy them at the knockdown bargain price of £13 as against the recommended retail price of £20, please do so later on. And without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to Yisha Xie, who's going to introduce tonight's topic. Before I do that, could I just remind you that this event is being live streamed and recorded. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Welcome everyone to the National Liberal Club. This is the very heart of liberalism in central London since the time of William Gladstone, Herbert Asquith, David Lloyd George, after whom this room is named. We have before us tonight a topic of outstanding importance and two outstanding speakers to discuss it. And firstly is the Right Honourable Sir Vince Cable. He's the former leader of Lib Dem, and he played a leading role in the coalition government as the Secretary of State for Business and Innovation and Skills. Many of them you remember his insightful commentary during the financial crisis and for his hard-hitting parliamentary interventions. Perhaps lots of people can remember when he talked about Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He said, having transformed in the office from Stalin, then become a Mr. Bean. So is his latest mark that people remember. Sir Vince's latest book is on China. If you haven't bought the book, here's a copy, and you can, just like Susanna mentioned. Edward Lucas is our prospective parliamentary candidate. I was told this is like a target seats for Lib Dem and about 12 most winnable conservative seats from conservative held seats in the country. Edward has a long career in journalism, specializing in security. He worked for the BBC, The Economist. Now he has a column in the Times, and I always read Edward's article in the Times. He has written 5 books, and he speaks many languages. So this constituency here has a special connection with China. They have home for the Chinese embassy just around the corner. And it's a PRC embassy for a long time there. They also is near the Chinatown. It's the heart of Chinese community here. I'm also particularly pleased to welcome the members of Chinese Lib Dem here this evening, and also people from within Lib Dem and outside with professional and personal connection with China. So Edward and Vince has agreed on many things, but their views on China are very different. So tonight they're going to discuss a few issues here. So first is how the Western should deal with China's rise on economics, military and geopolitical force. And what should the Democratic Party approach to China in terms of foreign policy, the environmental, security, human rights, and especially in Hong Kong, etc. Has Western's stance been too soft or too harsh? Have you got China wrong? So once we begin his debate in about 10 to 15 minutes, then Edward will respond, and we look forward to a very fascinating discussion, and also we look forward to hear the comments from the audience. So,
well, thank you for asking me. The purpose of this evening is to debate and disagree, but let me start with two things we will hopefully agree on, which is we all want to see Edward elected as the Lib Dem MP in this area, which is one of our most marginal seats. And, I've come to support his campaign. And the other thing I hope we'll agree on is that one of the key points about liberalism is amicable disagreement and debate. And in our party, sadly, as in the country as a whole, there is a bit of a culture creeping in of intolerance. I saw it a little bit when I was party leader in attitudes to colleagues who weren't 100% on the European campaign, and it's crept in quite virulently on gender identification and maybe on China. But that's not our way, and hopefully we will take a different approach here. Just be very clear from the outset, I don't claim to be a China expert. I'm not sure what a China expert is when you're talking about a country of 1.4 billion people. That's 25 times the UK, very diverse. My background, be very clear, I first started getting involved in China when I was at Shell. I was sent out to do a lot of the appraisal work before scenario planning, before Shell made its very big investments in China, which proved to be highly successful. Later, when I was in the coalition government, it was my job. I was president of the Board of Trade to engage with China on trade and investment, with Chinese companies, with British companies in China, and got heavily involved in the diplomacy around that time. And since then, when I left Parliament for a while before coming back, I did some work on the BRI in Africa, working with Nigerians. And more recently, I have a chair at the London School of Economics, and I spend a lot of time now with Chinese students and academics, and had time, unfortunately, to write books. My position is clear. I mean, I'm a Sinophile, but I'm also a Europhile and a Britannophile, if there's such a word, and an Indophile. Doesn't make me necessarily an apologist for everything this Chinese government happens to do. I mean, there are lots of bad things about China, and I'm fairly close to the top of the list at the moment. The fact that President Xi wants to continue in office, very worrying, actually, not just because of what he is and does, but because it's storing up a crisis in the future. I'm not quite sure if it's more worrying than the return of President Trump, which is also on the cards. But it's certainly worrying, and what Xi represents in terms of his rather bellicose nationalism and other features of his rule. So I'm not an apologist for the regime, but I do believe in having nuanced argument. I do believe in trying to understand where the Chinese are coming from and understand their take on things, which is very different. And I'm very alarmed, really, about the way this very propagandist type of Cold War has developed in the last few years. And my book is very much an argument for engagement with China, albeit with realism, recognizing that there are threats and as well as opportunities. But I just want to address two very specific issues. One is the question, is China a threat? And a threat to Britain, we can have generalized arguments about threatening behavior, but is it a threat to Britain? And the second is, can you and should you do business engage on cooperative areas, be it climate change or pandemic management or nuclear proliferation, with a country which has a fundamentally different system of government, it's not democratic, and has a totally different interpretation of what we refer to as human rights. So those are my two questions, and I'll try to address them within the 15 minutes you've given me. As far as the threat's concerned, I'll just start with two, you might think, rather minor issues in the bigger picture, but they're two things I happen to know quite a lot about. And the first is the Huawei story. I dealt with Huawei extensively when I was in the coalition. I was the minister responsible for dealing with them. And the judgment we made at the time was that there were threats associated with Huawei, but there were also big opportunities. They were ahead of the field in 5G, potentially 6G, and at the time in 4G. And there were advantages to working with them. I was nervous as somebody who didn't want to be accused of being a naive lefty. I kept consulting the security services and said, is it safe to have these guys implanted in GCHQ and elsewhere? And the answer always came back very, very clearly, unambiguously. This is a safe relationship. It is being managed. And if there are any risks associated with it, we've got them covered. That was the advice I had. And when I left government, Theresa May got the same advice, then after Boris Johnson. And we were always very clear about what the position was. And when the decision came on 5G, there was a compromise, which seemed to me eminently sensible, that you don't let a Chinese company with all the baggage associated with it into the inner core of the process where there is a security element, but that you welcome Huawei's involvement with as much of its technology as possible into the more peripheral areas of the network. And that was the British national interest. We weren't able to do that. The Americans blocked it. They had an embargo on key components that were necessary for the security of the system. We couldn't proceed without them. So effectively, Huawei's been kicked out of the network. And there's been a cost to that. Britain is no longer at the head of the telecoms technology because of it. But for people who are obsessed by security and imaginary security concerns, they would no doubt regard this as a victory, and they do in the House of Commons and elsewhere. And that leads on to my second point, which you might think is rather trivial, which was the case of Elizabeth Lee, which is the lady who was financing the office of Barry Gardiner MP. And this was heralded. There was an announcement, I think, from the head of MI5, discovered this Chinese infiltration of Parliament, no less. I mean, I have to say, as a former MP, I was MP for 20 years, that there are probably 50, at least, British MPs who are funded by relatively rich people who have quite strong links to their governments. You could start with the Tory Middle East Council, with a lot of Emirati and Saudi backers. You could talk about the Labour Party Friends of Pakistan, or India, Israel, whatever. There is a lot of parliamentary activity through all party groups, through friendship groups, is very strongly linked to funders who in turn are linked to governments of origin. It's just, the discovery of Elizabeth Lee was ridiculous, utterly ridiculous. And I would just add as a tailpiece, anybody who wanted to create an agent of influence in Britain, probably the last person they would have chosen was Barry Gardiner, who we all knew to be, frankly, a bit of a plonker and totally marginal to power in the UK. But anyway, those are very specific British issues. There is a much bigger picture that Edward knows far more about the big defense security story than I do. I'll just make a few, what I think are sort of common sense points. China spends 2% of its GDP on defense, as far as we can measure it, or the RAND Corporation, others can measure it. which is roughly the same as the UK, it's the NATO average. This is not the Soviet Union, which was once described as Burkina Faso with rockets. It's not that kind of economy, not even like modern Russia. Now, they do spend on defense, and they spend very wisely, it would appear, because they've built up a very modern, large, sophisticated navy and advanced cyber weaponry and space weaponry. But if you're looking at a country which is supposedly out to conquer the world, there's one rather bizarre feature of it, that their army, according to the Western defense exports, is extremely archaic, riddled with corruption, or was, political faction fighting, has no battle experience for 40 years or plus, and the last war they fought, they lost, Vietnam. This is not a serious military force on a, if you're trying to invade countries, you need an army. And China's not preparing itself for that kind of world. The last issue in which they were involved militarily, seriously, was the punch-up on the Indian border, and that matters a lot to India. But it's worth recording what was involved. There were 20 Indian soldiers killed, I think, and 4 Chinese. The battles were fought with sticks and stones and fists. Not a gun apparently was fired. The territorial change which took place on the back of it was measured in square inches, not in square miles. This was a Stone Age conflict in a nuclear age. And as a template for, Chinese military expansion, it's ridiculous. But there is one sense in which China is portrayed as a threat, not to us particularly in the UK, but to the West, certainly to the United States. And this relates to China's emergence as a massive economic power. And we just need a bit of arithmetic here. The Chinese economy, GDP size, is now almost certainly, depending on how you measure it, but under the IMF World Bank definitions, is considerably bigger now than the United States. But let's just say it's about the same size. And that's achieved on the basis of having a population of 1.4 billion. The United States is 330 million, so it's 4 times more. So with an average living standard of about a quarter of the United States. Now, if you conduct a little thought experiment and you say, well, supposing the Chinese continue to try to improve their living standards, I mean, why wouldn't they get up to, say, Romanian levels, which is about twice current average levels? They would then have, almost by definition, an economy which is twice as big as the United States. Now, it may not happen. The Chinese have got economic problems. They've got big corporate debt issues. They've got an aging population like the West, labor shortage issues, issues about whether they can handle the complex issues around bankruptcy and big state enterprises, all kinds of issues. But it seems quite plausible to me that given their functioning competence as a government in economic policy terms, that they will, they will continue to grow relative to the United States and the West. And if you can posit a situation where they get to a point where their economy is twice as big as the United States, it means still having half the living standards, they would then be spending twice as much on defense, they would be spending twice as much on R&D, and I think it's that as much as anything else which has caused this paranoia about the Chinese. It's actually not just about China, because by the middle of this century, India will be in the similar position. And the world in 2050 will probably, I mean, it's speculative, have 2 big superpowers, one of which is China, that will be very much number 1, and probably India, and then the United States. That is what the world will look like, probably. And I think the big challenge to us and the next generation is how we live with this new world. I mean, we're not used to this. After all, the West has been the hegemon, the United States recently, the Britain before that. the idea that Asian countries will dominate the world system is a very uncomfortable idea for Westerners, be it China or any other country. And that is what we have to deal with. And that leads us to the question of values. I mean, clearly, you know, there are a lot of bad things happening in China, and we're not going to debate that. I think we can all take that for granted. And they don't believe in Western democracy and never have, never practiced it. Very little indication they want to move in that direction, although there have been lots of elections at sort of what you might call parish council level, but certainly not more than that. So it's not democratic. They reject most of our Western concepts of human rights, though they have their own. I'll come to that in a moment. But you know, we're in a situation, a slightly uncomfortable position, where because most of the survey data that we have, you know, there are these quite sophisticated opinion bodies, Pew Research, Edelman, Harvard have done lots of sampling in China. As far as we can judge, and it is rather oblique data, the Chinese appear to have a high level of satisfaction with their government. It may not love it, but there appears to be a high level of trust and satisfaction. And there is some direct human evidence to support that, because until the pandemic, about 130 million people used to leave China every year, and about 130 million people used to go back, you know, study, enterprise, buying a flat in San Francisco, shopping in London, whatever. They used to go and they used to come. This is not the Soviet Union, which was a prison and which built the Berlin Wall to keep people in. That is not modern China. But clearly there are, you know, fundamental differences here, which I think have to be understood, I think, which is why is it that China isn't a prison? And although there may be no love, you know, why is it that there is a high level of acceptance, maybe more than acceptance of their regime? And I think two fundamental reasons. One is economic. You know, this is a system that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty since the Deng reforms. It continues to do so. The economy is slowing down now, but it's a remarkable achievement. 500 million, 600 million people now are in a, what we call a middle class, roughly Western living standards in the big cities. And people have every reason, given the history of poverty, going back centuries, horror stories like the Great Leap Forward under Mao Zedong, given that what has been achieved and the competence that lies behind it, you can understand why people don't want to throw it away. But I think there's a second reason, which is less discussed and less easily measured, which is stability, order, freedom from chaos. And when I talk to Chinese people about human rights, I say, well, you know, why don't you get more excited about the fact that you don't have, you can insult the government, because you can't. I mean, you're running into trouble. And they will give two examples of where the stability and the freedom from chaos really matters. They say, look, we're not trying to convert you people in the West to the Chinese system, but if we were, the first thing we would start with is American gun laws. Talking to many Chinese, their idea of the ultimate horror story is a country where everybody owns a gun and could shoot each other, you know, gun down children in playgrounds. I mean, that is the ultimate dystopian horror story. And they will say very angrily, you lecture us on, you know, genocide and human rights abuse, and yet this is something you people tolerate. And if you're going to be difficult, when we're in a stronger position, we will say to you, if you want to deal with China, you get rid of your Article 1 or whatever it is of the American Constitution, which of course is never going to happen. But their concept of human rights starts with things like that. And to take another example, which is more topical, which is COVID. Now, I mean, I happen to think the Chinese quarantine system is just diabolical and inhumane. But, you know, there are two ways of dealing with COVID. There's the Chinese way, zero COVID, and all the restrictions, regulations, etc., to control it and keep it down. Or there's the liberal way, which I used to advocate, which is the Swedish way. You know, you rely on people's trust and a sense of self-respect and so on. We've somehow gone down the middle in a very messy way. And when you talk to the Chinese about human rights, they will say, okay, you know, you lecturing us on these people we're supposed to have killed, though they claim they haven't. But you've allowed 150,000 people in Britain to die unnecessarily. Old people, you're not showing respect for them. 150,000 is 4 million grossed up into Chinese terms. And our friends in America, well, 1 million people died. You know, that's what we mean in China by human rights, you know, respect for life and protection of life. And we've done it in this very illiberal, controlling way. So I think we just need to get our heads around the fact that there is a major civilization out there which believes in human rights in its own way, doesn't believe in them the way we do. It's got nothing to do with press freedom, because they clearly don't have it, or having ballots in general elections, which clearly they don't have. But it's defined in a very Chinese way. So finally, let me conclude. I'm sorry I've talked too long already, Edward. What does this lead to? I think what it leads to is that however uncomfortable we are dealing with modern China, we have to engage with them, partly on, you know, bread and butter issues, and that's trade and investment, I used to do in the government, but on this sort of modern challenges to the global system, you know, global warming, nuclear proliferation, pandemic management, development in Africa. You know, they have their own system in parallel with the West, with different approach to debt. You know, we've got to do it together. Now, they're reluctant partners. There's a lot of hostility. It's not been helped. We shout at them. You know, Biden, you know, has adopted all Trump's economic and human rights policies, just shout at them. And relations are broken down. It's disaster, because these are issues we have to address. We have to engage. And that's actually the main message in my book. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Sevens, for the very provocative remarks. Now,
well, thank you very much indeed, Vince. Thank you, dear Yisha, who is out every weekend knocking on doors and delivering leaflets. It's something you can all do, and I'm so happy, Yisha. You're like a dynamo. If we put you onto the national grid, we wouldn't need to be worrying about energy prices. More of that, please. Now, Vince is a brilliant debater. It's a long time since we had someone of Vince's eloquence and quick-wittedness in the House of Commons. And I'm so glad you mentioned, Yisha, that point where you just left Gordon Brown fuming. Because Gordon Brown's a great man, but he does not like to be teased. And that line about Stalin turns into Mr. Bean went down in parliamentary history. So great, and we should have a kind of parliamentary school where you teach the next generation of Lib Dem MPs to do that. Now, we're not having a vote tonight, because I absolutely agree with Vince that we want to have an amicable and not an adversarial debate. Because one of the things that has pushed me into politics is this feeling of frustration with the sterile trench warfare, exemplified by the way our House of Commons is divided down the middle. Sort of absolutist idea that my adversary is not only wrong, but wrong-headed, utterly unreasonable, their views are not worthy of the slightest respect or appreciation. And I have to say that just ever so slightly, I wonder if tiny parts of our own dear Lib Dem party possibly come close to falling into something a little bit like that trap, but we can leave that for another occasion. But certainly in the context of China, we see this polarized debate quite clearly, that if you are a bit of a hawk? Well, you're obviously a puppet of the American weapons industry. You're on the take from Lockheed Martin. They're inventing this whole thing because they want to sell some more missiles. And you also show an insulting lack of appreciation of all the complexity and tragedy of Chinese history. You are the heir to the people who fought the Opium Wars, the people who burned down the Summer Palace, the people who imposed chaos and humiliation and warlordism on China. You're also jealous. You just can't stand the fact that the Chinese people are getting richer than the West, and they're getting cleverer than the West, and their technology works better than the West, and it's just sour grapes. And most of all, you're a racist. It's just yellow peril all over again. You just don't like people from that ethnic group, and you're disguising your prejudice in the language of geopolitics. And on top of that, you're trying to commit economic suicide because you want to cut off all trade with China. And combinations of those arguments are levied very readily. And I have to say, from the other side, including from people who I regard as allies, one also hears a kind of mirroring rhetoric, that there are these panda huggers, these people who maybe have deep clandestine romantic attachments to China. Maybe they're on the take. How much is he paid? They say. He must be a director of a Chinese firm. No sane person could say this without some kind of financial inducement. So you're a stooge of the Chinese Communist Party if you make any attempt to defend China, and very quickly the A word comes up of appeasement. And I'm a super hawk. I make no apology for that, and I'll explain why. But I also think it's really important to pick the grounds on which you're fighting and explain them, and to deal with your opponent's arguments not as you would like them to be, but as they actually are. Now, in Vince's excellent book, he gives 3 ways in which China might develop. He calls Sparta, the Davos, or the Ming model. I would argue there could be another one of fascism, as Melissa Chan, a brilliant Washington Post journalist, outlined in a recent article. But I don't know, because I'm not a China expert. I make absolutely no claim to be a China expert other than having read a few books. I regard myself as perhaps averagely educated on China. But what I do know about, because I've spent my entire life working on this, is how democracies defend themselves against dictatorships. And I started doing this back in the late 70s, raising money for human rights causes. I spent the 80s working with dissidents behind the Iron Curtain and lived there myself. And then after 1991, I carried on rather unfashionably, worrying about the way in which Soviet active measures were transforming and changing and becoming in some ways more potent in the hands of the Kremlin kleptocracy. And I'm now, having spent most of my life on that, I worry that I've been looking at the wrong thing. And even right now, as Russia seems poised to attack Ukraine, and we see that British citizens, following the American citizens' withdrawal, are being urged to leave Ukraine right now, I still think that in the long run, in the greater scheme of things, we need to be more worried about China than about Russia. Russia poses a horrible threat to its neighbors, but in the end, it is an economy the size of Italy. Measure it one way, a bit bigger if you measure it another, and it's run by extremely unpleasant people who basically are a bit like the Sopranos. If you really want to understand Russian politics, watch the Sopranos, and if you speak Russian, translate it into Russian as you watch, and you'll have a very good idea of how the Putin Kremlin works. China is not like that. The Chinese Communist Party, and we should always distinguish between China and the Chinese Communist Party, is subtler. It's more patient, thinks long term. It's more potent. It has capabilities that Putin could only dream of. Where are the world-beating Russian high-tech companies with their absolutely terrifying advances in quantum computing, material science, and artificial intelligence? Well, there aren't any. The Russians tried to have that. They built a high-tech part outside Moscow, and it's basically still a field. But actually, it's not that bothers me. I like competition. I like political competition. I like economic competition. Vince and I will agree on this as economists. Competition raises standards. So I'm delighted that China is giving us a run for our money. Nobody made us neglect our science and technology and engineering. Nobody made us decide that we weren't going to focus on these cutting edge technologies. No, we did that to ourselves because we were greedy and complacent. And equally, nobody made us divided. Now, it's true, China is a very big economy. The West, united, would be an even bigger economy. We had the chance 15 years ago to have the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And if we put those two organizations together, we would have had an economic rule setter which would have been far bigger and far more potent than the Chinese Communist Party's economy and any allies they had. Now, nobody made us not do that. We did that to ourselves because we were timid and protectionist and short-sighted, and now we have a great deal of ground to make up. So nobody made us complacent, nobody made us divided, we did that to ourselves, and maybe the threat, which I'm going to outline from China, will cause us to wake up and get our act together, and that will be good. But what really bothers me is not China's economic clout, it's not China's military clout, worrying though that is with the fortification of the reefs and rocks in the South China Sea and some of the new weapons, and particularly the space weapons, and what seems to be a rather cavalier attitude to the welfare of the global commons up above us. No, what bothers me is something which is best expressed with three appalling words. When I was at The Economist, my job was to delete words like this. So I hesitate to use them now, but I'm going to do so. Hegemonic discourse control. Hegemonic discourse control is a very neat way of explaining the way the Chinese Communist Party looks at the outside world. And it says very basically, very simply, that any discussion of China anywhere in the world is China's business, and China will exert whatever pressure it can to make sure that discussion goes the way that China likes and the conclusion is acceptable to China. And it was quite well expressed in the famous document number 9, which was leaked, I think, back in 2013. And it was also reiterated, elements of it, in the 14-point memo that the Chinese embassy issued to the Australian government when relations were very rocky, which was basically a series of instructions to the Australian government about how to run their political system. Please, no criticism of China, no funding for think tanks that say things about China we don't like, no activity in universities that China doesn't like, and so on. No 14-point memo, very easily Googled, you can find it. And the elements of hegemonic discourse control are very simple. It is to affect the media, the way that covers China, to affect academia, and the way China is researched and taught and studied. It's to affect the way in which the public square, our demonstrations, our political exchanges work, and the insides of our political system. Now, I'm not arguing that it's complete, absolutely not. If it was, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now. But it is absolutely clear that this is underway. One sees it big time in Canada, one sees it big time in Australia. If you haven't already done so, I strongly recommend that you read the brilliant book by Clive Hamilton, Silent Invasion. The most interesting thing about this book was it was so hard to get it published. No Australian publisher wanted to touch that book because they were afraid what it would do to their business in China. Claws of the Panda by John Mapplethorpe tells a very similar story in Canada. And there's also Hidden Hand, which looks at Chinese Communist Party influence in Europe. So this is sort of known about. But we see this is advancing in all sorts of ways, in ways that really upset me. Just down the road from here in 2015, when Xi Jinping was an honored guest of the British government, the British police used anti-terrorism laws against totally peaceful protesters. A handful of people just wanting to hold up A4 sheets of paper complaining about the human rights record in China. Now, I don't want to get into this argument that Vince has advocated about whether the Chinese approach to human rights is better or worse than ours. I know which I prefer because I know what would happen to people like me if we were in China. But I'm willing to debate that, but I'm not willing to debate it under constraint. We must maintain the right to protest, to have our historic freedoms, even if there is a Chinese visitor in London whose gaze is so fragile and so sensitive that he can't be exposed to the horrors of 3 middle-aged protesters holding up A4 sheets of paper. And it's the same in our universities. I don't know what the answer is about whether it's going to be Davos or Ming or Sparta, but I do know that I really object to the idea that our academic discourse is affected by the question of what will this do to our stream of funding from China. And that's happening. It's a great privilege in this constituency to have so many universities. And every university I go to has a problem with China. Sometimes it's a problem of intellectual property theft. Big deal down the road at Imperial College, where they're really worried about cutting edge technology and Chinese economic espionage. But more often, it's that the climate of free speech and free academic discussion has been chilled by the Ministry of State Security, by the United Front Work Department, by the agents of the Chinese embassy up there in Portland Place. Chinese students are afraid to speak publicly. They're afraid to submit essays electronically, because if they say something that is critical of the Chinese Communist Party, either they or their families back in China get into trouble. Just Google this if you don't believe me. Look what just happened at Brandeis University in America, where the Chinese authorities were intimidating Chinese students. And it isn't just the Chinese students. Look what's happened at LSE, my alma mater, where I studied student politics and got Simon Hughes elected, and on the side tried to get an economics degree rather less successfully. No, I did get it by the lowest possible mark, but I did actually squeak a 2-1. And I think my teacher, possibly Keith Bradley, may even be in the audience tonight. So if you're here, Keith, thank you very much indeed for having helped me squeeze my way through. But LSE put up an installation, an art installation of a globe upside down, which showed Taiwan in a different color from mainland China. And they got what in American sporting parlance is called a full court press from the Chinese Communist Party. They were told this was outrageous. It was a grievous blow. They'd irreparably hurt the feelings of the Chinese people by this disgusting, exactly the word that was used, this disgusting attempt to portray Taiwan as a different country on a sculpture. So this is happening all around us. Now, I'm not particularly bothered about Christine Lee and her activities in Westminster. We've seen a lot of this stuff already. I guess that MI5 had reason to call her out, and maybe they're trying to puncture the climate of impunity under which many other similar things go on. But what I am absolutely clear about is we need to maintain the integrity of our cultural and academic and media discourse. Does anyone here like to mention the last time that Hollywood produced a film that was remotely critical of the People's Republic of China? Exactly. 7 years in Tibet, and Richard Gere's career has tanked. He now makes excellent films, but they're all independent films. They win prizes. But you see the perfect example of hegemonic discourse control in the squeeze on Hollywood, which hasn't even worked. Hollywood sold its soul to China in the hope of getting access to the largest film market in the world. And now the Chinese film industry is doing so well, Hollywood having sold its soul, doesn't even manage to get its films into China, even with multiple kowtows. And some of you may have seen the absurd business of Fight Club being re-edited in order to have an ending that was not quite as anarchic and from the Chinese Communist Party point of view, morally degrading as the original. Now, of course, that's not new. Many of you will know that Casablanca only came out in German in 1975 because the real version was considered too strong meat for the West German audience. But it's still absolutely vital we maintain the ability, because if we don't do that, we don't have the ability to think about China ourselves. Now, getting China wrong is our subject tonight. And I've outlined what China's doing that we need to worry about. And the first point of getting China wrong is don't ignore this. If you ignore this is happening, that is a massive mistake. Now, of course, it's also very important not to overreact. And I'm very strongly critical of the so-called China initiative of the American Department of Justice, which seems to have taken the approach to Chinese academia that our trawlers do to their fishing grounds of sweeping up absolutely everything. And it's falling apart under very justified criticism. And it's also getting China wrong to think there's an easy answer. This is these are dilemmas that go to the heart of what it means to be an open society. The price of open society is people make mistakes and your openness may be abused. So it's absolutely not the case that we will have a nice series of bullet points in the next Lib Dem manifesto. And when we have a majority Lib Dem government, we will then implement these bullet points and the problem will be solved. That may be the case in some other parts of our political and economic dilemmas, although I can't actually work out what they are. But I do not say this is going to be easy. But the final point, and I'll end here, because I don't want to talk for longer than Vince, because that would be bad manners, is that it is the greatest mistake is to say that it'll be catastrophic to push back. And all through the discussion of China, you hear again and again, well, if you do this, I mean, the roof's going to fall in. You're not going to have any trade with China. You're going to lose all your jobs. The light's going to go out. The Chinese are going to get really angry. University is going to go bankrupt, and so on, and so on, and so on. And we catastrophize about the consequences of standing up to China. But just look at what actually happens. Now, I disagree with Vince about Huawei for reasons we can possibly go into later. But what is absolutely clear is we were told it was impossible. You cannot have 5G without Huawei. You're going to put yourself back in the dark ages. Well, guess what? We managed to, we and many other countries, in fact, all American allies, have basically taken the same approach to Huawei. And guess what? We have not suffered a massive technological setback. Look at rare earths. China tried to corner the market in these rare earths, which are not actually rare, they're just difficult to and messy to refine. But we see at once other countries, my beloved Estonia is one, Australia is another, getting into the rare earths business and breaking the Chinese cartel. Australia was told that they were going to be, I think, a chewing gum on China's shoe if they dared, because the impudence of the Australian government in saying they wanted an independent inquiry into the coronavirus outbreak. Now, it's very interesting. Yes, there were sanctions on Australia, but the latest report is actually Australia hasn't done badly. It may have even done quite well from the sanctions, not least because clever middlemen started selling those Chinese goods, so the Australian goods, wine and so forth, to China at quite a markup. And these supposedly terrifying sanctions against Australia have turned out to be anything but. And perhaps most importantly, the wolf warrior diplomacy, this wonderfully entertaining mixture of very badly phrased English delivered with extreme ill humor, very frequent intervals, which we saw from Chinese embassies and missions all over the Western world, this very intimidating, unpleasant language, and which I decided to expose in a newsletter I ran. And every week we had the Wolf Warrior Award for the most obnoxious and counterproductive statement by any Chinese official. And we wrote to them and said, well done, you've won, the consul in Hamburg for trying to crush a German children's book, which stated that the coronavirus pandemic began in China. And for that appalling offensive statement, this tiny little Hamburg publishing house was told, not only will you never sell another book in China and never print another book in China, none of your authors, whoever they may write for, will ever sell another book in China. And extraordinary pressure, and they're accused of being racist and everything. Of course, they kowtowed at once. They pulped every copy. I've got a copy of that book, but I think there are very few surviving. It's meant for German 7-year-olds, so I'm not particularly excited by it. But they kowtowed at once, and everyone said, oh my goodness, here the German publishing industry will never be the same again. But we pushed back against wolf warrior diplomacy. And guess what? The Chinese themselves have said, this doesn't work. They now say, let's present a friendly and positive face to China. Now, I rather regret that. I liked wolf warrior diplomacy because it gave us all a good laugh. But the fact is, when you push back, you get somewhere. It's not catastrophic. Lithuania, tiny Lithuania, 3 million people pushing back against the might of the Chinese Communist Party. And we said, you're toast. You'll never survive. But you know what? Actually, they're doing rather well. Lithuania has stood up. It's the mouse that roared. And the Chinese Communist Party has realized it's actually not so easy to intimidate a country when it is a member of the EU and it's defended by the customs union and the single market. So hegemonic discourse control is really brittle. When you push back, you can break it. And if we do not push back, we risk a really serious defeat, which is that we compromise our ability to understand what's happening in China. We need to be able to research, to discuss, to debate, as we're doing right now, without the feeling that we are risking financial, personal, other catastrophic consequences, because we're not. But let's push back. And as Vince, in his other great book, Free Radical, which I enjoyed very much at the time of rewritten, finishes with a very rousing sentence, which I would like to end my remarks on now. It's no time to quit. Thank you very much. You want to make a quick response?
Yeah, sorry, I hadn't thought of it in those terms. There were just one or two things that stuck out. Edward made this interesting point about when G came to Britain and there were serious restrictions on freedom of protest. Of course, this isn't exactly a China issue, is it? I mean, we have just passed legislation, or I think of passing legislation in Britain now, which forbids the right to protest if you make a noise that upsets people, amongst other things, or if you glue yourself to the road and disrupt the traffic. You know, that's how much we care in this country about the right to protest. Let's be very clear. It's not a question of deferring to the Chinese. I mean, it may be that we were excessively deferential of President Xi's visit. But, you know, if we really believe in the right to protest, we should bloody well practice it. That should be the starting point. And for reasons completely unconnected with China, you know, we have a government that is abandoning one of the very basic elements of Western liberal democracy. And I think our party sort of spoke things about it in Parliament, but it's hardly at the frontier, at the front of our campaigning or anybody else's. It's just been allowed to happen. You know, and to a degree, you know, I agree with Edward's view about this discourse control. You know, we in the West are more subtle about these things. You know, we do soft power, and we do it much more subtly. After all, most people in the world speak English. Not many people speak Chinese, so that the language doesn't come across in this very crude, caricaturish way you get from wolf warriors. But we do it because, you know, the West has dominated the discourse space, to use that language, for such a long time. You know, we don't need to. And the influence is nonetheless very powerful. And you know, and control is exercised in all kind of more subtle ways. It doesn't necessarily come through the government. If you go against powerful interests in this country, you meet resistance, which is more subtle, but nonetheless more just as powerful as when the Chinese try to suppress it. Let me just, maybe a little self-indulgent, but just mention my own experience with Edward's boss, Mr. Murdoch. I think it was widely known that, you know, I was subject to people carrying hidden microphones. What was less known was that there was a detachment of people who were prepared and organized to go through all my dustbins for a year, analyzing documents. It's the kind of thing that the Chinese would probably do in a higher tech way, but it was part of our way of doing things here. And I discovered a few weeks ago from Evan Harris, who's been following up the hacking scandal, that my phone was hacked for years. Everything I was saying on my mobile phone was being analyzed because I might give the wrong position. So, you know, this idea that we have this sort of wicked controlling Chinese state was just trying to stop people expressing themselves in a liberal democratic way, and we're with this sort of free society here. Well, you know, of course I value our freedoms such as we have, and the Chinese state is not remotely like it. But let's just not be naive and too self-congratulatory about our own system, because, you know, there's a lot to be careful about. And I'll give it a chance to come in a minute. I don't want to hog the debate, but there were several things I didn't talk about when I was speaking, but were sort of implicit in some of Edward's remarks. I mean, I think the whole issue about the freedom to demonstrate, which he talked about, and has really came to the fore in the issues around Hong Kong. And I'm horrified, as I'm sure you all are, to see, you know, young idealistic Democrats hauled off to prison and newspaper editors closed down. But actually what people in Britain were never told was some of the background to all of this, that when Margaret Thatcher, you know, went to negotiate with Deng Xiaoping and Percy Craddock and so on, the rules around demonstrations were very clearly spelt out. I mean, Deng made a series of speeches on newspaper articles at the time, which have been translated in Vogel's brilliant biography, amongst others. And essentially what the Chinese said through Deng, and this was 40 years ago, but it was supposed to relate to now, said, we'll go along with this scheme. We don't believe in your two-system approach, but we'll let it happen. You know, you want to criticize us, you criticize us. One thing we will not tolerate, however, it was quite open, there was nothing hidden about it, is disorder, chaos. Violent demonstrations, they will be stopped. The experiment will be stopped. But people here and in Hong Kong didn't seem to understand that there is a difference between the right to protest peacefully and the right to riot. And that was the trigger that gave the Chinese the opportunity to crack down. And it was tragic. And I thoroughly agree with what the British government's done since in terms of giving Hong Kong people the right to come here, absolutely the right response. But, you know, we should be a little bit careful, I think, before just assuming that these, you know, principles that we espouse, you know, they're valued differently in China, and there's nothing crude about it, nothing hidden. They've always been very clear about issues like freedom to demonstrate and freedom of speech.
I'd just like to add perhaps an annoying note of agreement here by saying that Vince is absolutely right that a lot of the things that go wrong are the result of our own naivety and greed. And I would particularly highlight that the reason our universities are so vulnerable to the pressure of Chinese money is we've told them to act like businesses. And we've told them, go out and sell your product, your service as widely as possible, get as much research money as possible. The more money you make from abroad, the less money you'll need from a taxpayer, and that's good. And we're then surprised, having created this very large open goal, that the Chinese gently kick a ball into it and reap the benefits from it. So again and again, the answer to this is not, I think, so much in trying to deter China from doing it with a whole array of new laws or anything like that. The simplest thing, if you have rain coming in through the hole in the roof, is to fix your roof rather than blaming the rain. But I know there's an awful lot of China and indeed Russia and other expertise in the audience, including people who have lived through things that I've only written about. So I think at this stage, Yisha, should we take some questions from the floor, and Vince and I will do our best to answer them.
So now it's question time, and could people just make it very short? Unfortunately, we don't have lots of time. Each one ask one question, yes. And give you first, okay, tell people your name and ask one question. Don't make speech, please, just make question.
Thank you that's quite loud. Thank you very much, Vince and Ed. Appreciated that. The conversation was really interesting to hear all the nuance and a great amicable disagreement. The last big issue I can think of where there was one existential issue whereby indulging or ignoring it resulted in large amounts of money for private corporations are environmental concerns. And I think slowly what we're seeing in the commercial sphere is that companies are realizing that providing value to investors involves ensuring that there's a world for those investors to live in. And I think we have a similar situation with regards to coercion and free speech and taking money from China. And I'm wondering whether either of you see in the future a sort of unionization against Chinese impositions on free speech, and whether you think that that is a possible counterweight to the current state of affairs.
We take several questions. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Hi, what does Vince recommend we do if if China were to invade Taiwan next week?
Admirably short question, more such short questions, please.
Yeah, thanks. Given Europe's decline in the future and Asia's rise, should our goals be to protect our democracies and way of life, or should we continue to try to project our version of democracy and human rights, or should we just sort of hunker down?
You want me to start? Well, I think just answer the last one first, because I don't think I need to elaborate. I made the point in what I was saying, that I think our conservatives should be to protect our democracy. Being missionaries is not going to work, and the Chinese in particular will not accept this sort of foisted on some Western model, and their history, you know, is unfortunately doesn't encourage chaotic adventures. I mean, it's not just the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and the Civil War and the Chinese invasion and the Taiping Rebellion, the whole history. They did try democracy for a few months, and I think 1923, they had an election of all male voters, but within 6 months, the whole thing had collapsed into warlordism. They're not going to repeat it. But yeah, we've got to defend our own. Of course we have. I mean, I would agree with that. In terms of that admirably clear question about Taiwan, of course, if they invade next week, there's absolutely nothing whatever that we will do about it, or the Americans will do about it. I'm not in a position to do anything about it. But I think it's wildly improbable that they would. It's not just my judgment as a kind of interested observer, but General Milley, who was the chief of staff in the United States, was asked this similar type of question in the Senate, I think, and said, look, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric around this, but they're not going to invade. It's highly improbable. It's possible, but it's highly improbable, certainly in the short run. And there's a history here. We have accepted, and this is the delicacy of that problem, we have accepted, the Americans have accepted, most major powers have accepted that there is one China, which is why Taiwan isn't recognized as an independent country. You know, we want to keep it as an independent entity. It's got a valuable, you know, successful mixed economy. It's got a thriving democracy led by a liberal party, which is our sister party, as far as I recall. So naturally, we want to preserve that. But the Chinese have understood from 70 years ago, when this whole controversy started, that the advantages of being pragmatic. They've been bellicose for decades. I mean, I remember as a child watching black and white television, the Chinese bombardments of these offshore islands. I mean, they've never accepted the legitimacy of Taiwan, but in practice, they've accepted there's a lot to be gained by cooperating with them. There are lots of Chinese go backwards and forwards to China. Chinese people go to Taiwan. There's an enormous amount of Taiwanese investment in China. The big company called Foxconn is one of their biggest employers in Guangdong. So they say one thing and they do another. There's absolutely no reason, and the Chinese are always rational, as to why they should change that. So they will remain bellicose and threatening and send aircraft over and frighten people. But why would they want to disturb what is a perfectly, from their point of view, a perfectly sensible arrangement? The first question, I wasn't sure what it was about essentially, but I think what's the point about you talked about environmental threats. I think actually this is one area where there's quite a lot of common ground. I mean, we know that China is, you know, massive greenhouse gas emitter, far bigger than anybody else. They burn lots of coal. But unlike many other countries, and you could list Saudi, Russia, India, quite a lot of others, the Chinese get it. You know, they get the fact that there is a big problem for which they have major responsibility. They had a program which was quite advanced and is still there for moving out of coal in the long run. It can't be done overnight. Into renewables, they have the best developed renewable industry in the world, as far as we can judge, and solar panels and wind farms and nuclear, mini nuclear. And they will do it. And it was interesting that in the height of this new Cold War in Glasgow, one area where there was a genuine mutual discourse, not a dominating discourse from China, was the agreement between Kerry and his Chinese opposite number to, in broad terms, to collaborate. And that's what we have to do. And I think the Chinese get that, and plenty of evidence they will. Just a final point, if I might. I'm sorry I've talked for a long time, but just a small point, which is partly in response to what Edward said earlier about the impact on British universities. I mean, I happen to be at the London School of Economics at the moment. I walk past this globe every day of the week, and it's still there. I mean, they haven't withdrawn it. But what has also shocked me about the London School of Economics was that a year or so ago, there was a proposal from a Chinese business person to donate a large sum of money to fund the department I was in. And the council or deliberative body in the school turned it down very narrowly, but they turned it down. And the arguments were not that this is wrong or that the Chinese government will influence us. The businessman had no political background at all, but this will be bad publicity. The Telegraph and the Spectators will tear us to pieces. We're taking Chinese money. We mustn't do it. It's bad for the image. You know, we took money from Gaddafi years back. So this is another scandal. We mustn't do it. It was entirely a public relations move, nothing whatever to do with Chinese infiltration of universities. And it's done the school actually quite a lot of harm. Anyway.
I think I'm going to stand up because it's nice to be able to see the people at the back. First of all, the point about LSE is that they were threatened. They didn't give in to the threat, and the globe is still there. And a lot of people said, if you don't get rid of that globe, you'll be toast. You won't get not another Chinese student is going to come. I very much dispute the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is rational. I think if you look at the history of China under Chinese Communist Party rule, it would be hard to argue that the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were epitomes of rational political or economic statecraft. And you only have to look at the enormous gulf in prosperity between Taiwan, or Republic of China. Is Joe here, by the way? Joe? No, the Taiwanese mission in London was hoping to come this evening. Just look at the difference in living standard, in life expectancy, in welfare between Taiwan, which admittedly was under a horrible military dictatorship for decades, but does now have the benefit not only of a multi-party democracy and a market economy, but also the inestimable benefit of being run by a member party of the Liberal International. Fortune which is rarely bestowed, unfortunately, on countries, on other countries. But you just see there's an enormous difference. And I mean, I think you can very easily make the case, and many people would, that the Chinese Communist Party has actually held China back hugely. And it's only when the Chinese Communist Party dropped the most absurd and dogmatic elements of the economic, particularly the economic model bequeathed by Mao, that the Chinese people, through their immense hard work and ingenuity and talent, were able to start getting rich again, and that the Chinese Communist Party likes to take the credit for it. And it's not absolutely clear to me that certainly there's 100% of the credit belongs to them. And the final point about democracy, well, Sandra, it will come as no surprise to you. I think we should promote democracy vigorously, and we should do so everywhere. We should do it in Russia, we should do it in North Korea, we should do it in Venezuela, we should do it everywhere, because we believe that it's better. It gives people more chance to influence their lives, improves their chance of living happy lives, lessens the chance of leaders making mistakes. And I think we see very clearly in China right now the danger of having very tight circles of decision making. So yes, and of course the best way to promote democracy is not necessarily by cranking up the old shortwave radio transmitters again, nostalgic though that makes me and my other friends here from Bush House in the 1980s. No, the best way to promote democracy, to preach it, is to practice it. And of course, I absolutely agree with Vince that if we go around marketizing our political system, so the country is run by the rich for the rich, and if we regard political protest and political disagreement as inconveniences that have to be managed and reduced so we can all get on with the important business of making money, then of course our model of democracy doesn't look very attractive. And that's why, as Liberal Democrats, we strongly defend democracy at home just as strongly as we promote it abroad.
Thank you very much. I know all about hegemonic control, discourse control, Edward, because I think I'm the only former member of the Human Rights Subcommittee of the European Parliament who is not banned from China because of Brexit, myself and my former colleague Phil Bennion. And indeed, it was after Phil proposed Ilham Tohti, the Uyghur academic, for the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, that both Phil and I got an immediate phone call from the Chinese embassy to take back the nomination, which actually was quite frightening. But my question to Edward in particular is, what leverage do we have in the West when we so urgently depend on Chinese cooperation on issues particularly like climate change, but also the pandemic? Thank you.
Let's have a question from the front as well.
If I may, I'd like to put a question. So up until 3 weeks ago, I was with the BBC World Service for Television. So I've spent 30 years in the BBC, and I was the news producer who broke the news about the rape and torture of Uyghur women in the Xinjiang camps. I should say that the latest reports I've been getting from eyewitnesses in the last few weeks is that this is continuing atrocity, which is a stain on humanity. The question I've got is this, is that in the last few years, I've engaged and listened to Chinese citizens and engaged with Chinese Democrats at their invitation in Hong Kong, in Korea, in Taiwan on several occasions, and in London. And my view is that they have a deep desire and aspiration for democracy. And the idea that democracy is just for us in the West and not for the people of China is something that I utterly repudiate. And one of the things I've done is to leave the BBC. I'm now the parliamentary spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats in Sutton and Cheam. Thank you. And I will be campaigning because, like Edward, I believe in the universality of human rights. But more deeply than that, the universality of the dignity of the individual person, that it is right for us as Liberal Democrats, and I put to our esteemed panel, what steps would you take to work with those in the underground in China to see that their aspirations for human dignity, for freedom of religious expression, for freedom of gathering together. The idea that China doesn't protest, by the way, there are tens of thousands of protests in China every year, environmental protests, property rights protests, protests for the right of citizens not to have their property taken by the state. The BBC reports on this day in, day out. Just tune into the World Service or look on BBC Online. So what should we be doing as Liberal Democrats to ensure that their aspirations are given the same recognition as the aspirations of those for freedom and from oppression around in other countries in the world?
I think, Rahima, it's high time we heard from someone who actually has, you should explain who you are, Rahima.
Thank you. I'm Uyghur. I'm Rahima Mahmood from the World Uyghur Congress and the co-founder of the Stop Uyghur Genocide. My question to Sir Vince Cable, I don't expect the same compassion from the Holocaust survivors and other genocide survivors towards the Uyghurs, that we are experiencing the genocide in the 21st centuries. And the word liberal Democrats, and that is why I left my country in 2000, leaving my 5-year-old child and 9 siblings. And luckily my son reunited with me 2 years later. And now I don't know what happened to all my siblings since January 2017. My phone completely cut off because of this tragedy that is happening. I was shocked when I read some of your tweets and completely kind of denying and not using the same standard of, what we have in this country to the people like me and my people. And I find it very difficult for someone who represent liberal Democrat. And that is one of the things that we really, really fighting. I can say I fought for all my life. I was at the square, Tiananmen Square. I left the square on the 2nd of June in 1989. Thousands of students died. I left my country because of 1997 Rolja massacre. Hundreds were killed for just peacefully protesting, demanding the human rights that was promised under sorry, I'm just becoming a bit too emotional.
We need a
again.
question, Rahima.
So all this, I would like to ask you, as Servians Cable, would you agree to meet people like me and some camp survivors to learn more about China, more about CCP? Thank you.
Well, I'll go first this time. I think, Irina, and by the way, when you finish campaigning in Cities of London Westminster, please go over the river to Southwark and help get Irina onto Southwark Council. So I think you're running in May, aren't you? Yeah. I think that we have to look at what China is doing, the Chinese Communist Party is doing, and pick their weakest points and exploit them. And I think that the scope and rigidity of, for example, their approach to language gives us a lot of low-hanging fruit. So if you are told, under no circumstances are you to use the word Taiwan, which is basically what they say. And so if you're on an airport, for example, you're not allowed to have the flag of Taiwan Republic of China. You have possibly the letters TWN are allowed. And I always look at this now, if your website, you're not allowed to have in your drop-down menu, you have to put Chinese Taipei. Well, this is very easy for us to resist because we can do what the LSE did and say, you know what, I'm going to call it Taiwan. Now what are you going to do? And when enough countries do that, as Lithuania has showed, and now Slovenia is following, and the Czech Republic is going to be next, and then there'll be others. Once enough countries do that, it's like the Wizard of Oz. You know, I'm sorry, what are you going to do? I just used the word Taiwan. You know what? I'm going to use it again. Taiwan, Taiwan, Taiwan. And yeah, what are you going to do? And I've done this to Chinese officials, mainland officials, when I meet them at parties, and they get very cross and they say, you're banned from China for life. And I say, fine. I say, you mean I'm banned from bandits in temporary control of the mainland China, but I'm not banned from Republic of China. And you can wind them up, good and proper. So let's do it. Rahim, I have nothing to add to your eloquent point. And to David, I would say, let's start boxing clever on this. We used to do this during the Cold War. We can do it again. It's difficult to the surveillance society. One very important thing is to put pressure on the Vatican not to throw the underground church under the bus. As many of you will know, the Holy See is the only country in Europe that still maintains diplomatic relations with Taiwan, Republic of China. And unfortunately, the Pope Francis seems to be getting ready to recognize the patriotic Catholic Church in China and throw the underground church back into the catacombs. And that's something that we can put some pressure on. But I think we need to get back into the old mentality of the active measures working group, which we had during the Cold War. We were bloody good at it. Some of us indeed at this room, I'm not quite sure who's here, but I think there are some people who may have a more than passing acquaintance with the sort of tactics that we used to get up to, and they were very effective. We should do them again.
Yes, well, let me deal straight off with your very challenging, and obviously, disruptively serious issues around Xinjiang. I mean, I have actually met quite a lot of Uyghurs. There are a small community in London, but I've met quite a lot of them. Most of them echo you. Quite a lot of pro-regime. Quite a lot of don't want to get involved in politics. Actually, the saddest comments I had from Uyghurs we're not people who are complaining about the regime. They may have not liked them. There were people who had worked across China, lived across China. Lots of Uyghurs are traders across China. And what happened, and the reason they're now here, is that after the terrorist bombings, well, you shake your head, but we accepted, the Americans, everybody accepted that there was a very serious spate of terrorist bombings. And what happened was that as Uyghur people traveled in China, they found that when they got to bus stops, the Chinese people would not allow them on. You may be a bummer, right? They wouldn't allow them into a hotel. And it was that sense of hurt of being rejected by Han Chinese, effectively, because of their experiences that turned them against China and why they've come here. But I think that the point one has to acknowledge from the Chinese point of view, I mean, I'm sure there are terrible things happen. I've never disputed that for a moment. Is that it started with a reaction, or a key part of it was a reaction to a terrorist operation, which was fired by separatism and religious fundamentalism. Well, you shake your head, but so there's massive documentation about this. One of the brigades of the Islamic State, according to the Israelis, who have no particular reason to take a position on this, was made up of people who had come out of the East Turkish-style Islamic movement. I mean, this is what the Chinese reacted to, and Chinese people appear to have reacted to, and it was horrific, and they have massively overreacted. Counterterrorism, not just in China, has often taken this form. And I was an MP. I used to have refugees coming to see me from 20 countries with horrific tales of abuse and torture, which I'm sure were genuine. I'm just going through some of the list I met in my last year, but Baluchis from Pakistan, Kashmiris from India, Palestinians, lots of other countries. You could go into the Papuans of Indonesia, who hundreds of thousands of whom are alleged to have been killed. We don't know. Now, those are, I'm sure that there is, these are authentic accounts, probably about 20 countries in the world where this kind of thing has happened. And the problem for us as a Western government that deplores these things is, well, what do you do with their governments? Do we cut off our links with all of them? I mean, this is a very real question. And I was a member of a government and which had to deal with it. The problem I had personally was I thought there was at least one country in the world that was seriously worse than China on human rights grounds, and that was Saudi Arabia. Right? And I'd said rude things about their regime. And and I had to accept as a trade minister, was I going to boycott them or not? And I accepted that it was in the British interest. We had to engage with them. Though what they were doing is horrific, still is. The idea that you can have a protest outside, when there's an official visit to Saudi Arabia is a joke. I mean, absolutely no democracy, no choice, brutal suppression. As bad or worse than in China. So, it is horrific. The one point where I've offended a lot of people is I've taken the view of The Economist magazine. The Economist is not a pro-Chinese journal, rather a bit of a hawk, I think, in your language. But they did what I did, they read through a lot of the documentation alleging, quote, genocide in Xinjiang. And they said, what is happening there is dreadful, but to call it genocide is absolutely, completely wrong. This has nothing whatever to do with the kind of horrors that happened in the Holocaust or Rwanda. This is a totally different situation. This is a brutal, probably, overreaction to a terrorist movement. And that we should, of course, criticize it and condemn it, but this is not genocide or anything remotely like it. And because I've tried to be honest about the use of language, and not just me, but others are trying to be honest about the use of language, we get pilloried. And this is not helpful, and it's not helpful ultimately to the Uyghur cause either. Then that leads on to the second question that somebody asked, was, well, how do you relate to people in China who have civil human rights issues? Do you support them? How do you engage with them? Well, I would say this, when I went to China, I did, right? When I went with Cameron and Osborne to see the president, we raised the issue of Tibet, which has probably had a longer, and in many ways a worse history than Xinjiang. And the Chinese were perfectly capable of dealing with it. They said the one thing, the ambassador said to us, look, the one thing is, for God's sake, don't just spring this by surprise and start shouting in the media. If we know you're going to raise it, we'll happily debate it with you and try and explain our point of view. But we don't want to be publicly humiliated by foreigners coming and telling us how to run our country. So, you know, we'll have a dialogue about it. Of course it is. Of course it's their country. Of course it's part of China. And that's just the problem. I went to see a man called Huawei, who is now in the Politburo, was then party secretary in Guangdong province, and had a long conversation about labor rights. I have responsibility for labor rights in Britain, the right to strike. He accepted that China was way behind the UK in terms of labor rights. It's a socialist country, but it's, you know, old-fashioned capitalist labor relations. And we're a wicked capitalist country that has protections for workers and regulation. And was happy to have a vigorous debate on it. I also met people who had been persecuted, who came to the consulate, wanted to talk to me, people who had been affected by the blood transfusion scandal, gays who have a hard time in China, feminist groups, and having a dialogue with them was perfectly possible. I don't know whether it still is, but it was certainly possible at that time to make it very clear that we identified with them and a common cause. But simply turning up in China and shouting at the government, you know, you are not behaving the way we think you should, it's not a way to make any influence whatever on the Chinese. They just feel angry and insulted and they shout back. Has no impact whatever. But I think if things are raised in a proper way, you can make some sort of impact. And I think the final point relates to that, which is this idea of pushing back, this famous expression, and that we shouldn't be intimidated over economic issues. Well, of course, the problem is that the Chinese see exactly the same problem inversely. Because when the Trump administration launched its tariff policy, when the Americans brought in more and more sanctions, controls, economic, the Chinese reaction was, okay, you think you're trying to hurt us, but we'll respond to it by becoming more and more self-sufficient. So what's happening right now is we are, quote, pushing back by disengaging from relations with China, and they're pushing back against us by disengaging from us. And we're getting an increasingly polarized system. It was highly integrated, it's now becoming highly polarized. And that is very dangerous because the economics is feeding the politics.
Well, time's pressing on, and I think we need to get on to the. So I think we skip our closing remarks. We're not going to have a vote. I just want to make one brief final point, which is, I think that what Vince has just said exemplifies my point about framing. That if you are in favour of pushing back against China, you're in favour of polarizing the world economy and going to self-sufficiency. I didn't say let's push back on, particularly on trade and investment. I think that that might have been desirable. Maybe we should have rethought the WTO membership 20 years ago. I don't know. I was talking about pushing back on the stuff where we are on our strongest ground, which is where they try to dictate the way we speak, the way we act, the way we write, the way we communicate. That is where I think the real battle is. We're not going to, I mean, I think there may be some obstacles to trade and investment as a result of the geopolitical tensions, but I'm actually quite skeptical about economic sanctions on the whole, and they can sometimes work, but they never work anything like as well as their advocates promote. And I also think it's a mistake to frame this in terms you either, if you criticize China, it means you turn up and shout at them in the Chinese Communist Party in meetings. I don't believe, I may believe in doing things which will lead them to shout at us in meetings, but that's another matter. So let's get away from this idea that there is a sort of simple dichotomy where if you stand up to China, it's economic suicide, rude and counterproductive. There's plenty of stuff that we can do that's in our power, not least us standing up, acting according to our own values, which is extremely potent and removes one of their biggest weapons, also one of the Kremlin's biggest weapons. And incidentally, wish to say you're just a bunch of greedy hypocrites. If we stop being greedy hypocrites, we're already halfway towards victory.
So before I hand over to Susanna for the final bits, shall we give another big applause to two speakers?
Thank you, Yisha. Thank you, Savin. Thank you, Edward. So this is just one of our events. There are many more. In the coming weeks, we have Tom Burke on climate change. We have Fiona Hill, one-time top Kremlin expert in the White House on class, race, sex, and Trump. And we also have Oliver Below on Britain, butler to the world. So to find out more about these, please go to Edward's website. And before we finish, I'd like to pay particular thanks to Constance and Zoriana and Alexander for their work. And thank you so much to all of you for coming. And Andrea, I am so sorry I couldn't see you, Andrea. Andrea, thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's been a great pleasure.
And the live stream. It's all been
and thank you very much. And thank you to our live stream team. Thank you so much. As Constance rightly points out, Savince's book is for sale, and please do see Sally, who's there with the machine for any donations.
And if you're free tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, Marylebone Street, door knocking and leafleting. Every Saturday, every Sunday, we're there.